Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The empire was dying. Emperor Victor stood on the balcony of his crumbling palace, looking out over what remained of Australia. The city that had once been the crown jewel of civilization, with its towering spires and golden streets, was now a shadow of its former self. Smoke rose from distant fires, and the wails of the desperate filled the air. The war had ravaged every corner of the empire, leaving behind broken bodies and shattered hope. He gripped the cold stone rail, his knuckles white. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red hue across the horizon, as if the very sky mourned the fate of his kingdom. His people were starving, his armies decimated, and rebellion brewed in every province. But it wasn't just the enemy at the gates that terrified Victor. It was the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at his soul. He had promised his people he would protect them, that he would preserve the legacy of his ancestors. And now all of it was slipping through his fingers. "Your Majesty, they are waiting," came a voice from behind him. Victor turned to see Darius, his most trusted general and childhood friend, standing in the doorway. His face was etched with the same worry that plagued Victor's every thought. "They have no answers," Darius Victor said, his voice strained. "They only offer retreat or surrender." "They are scared, as we all are," Darius replied, stepping closer. "But we cannot give up hope. The people look to you for strength." Victor let out a bitter laugh. "Strength? What strength? My armies are broken, my people starve, and the wolves are at our door." Darius' eyes softened. "There may still be a way. Victor, you are more than just an emperor to us. You are our hope." Victor shook his head. He wanted to believe in those words, but every day brought more bad news, more death, and the empire couldn't survive much longer. "Lead me, Victor," said his voice barely above a whisper. Darius hesitated, but then bowed and left the room alone. Victor let out a long breath and sank into his chair. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. How had it come to this? He had been crowned emperor in a time of peace and prosperity. Australia had been strong then, its borders secure, its people happy. But over the years, the tides of war had swept across the land, and Victor had found himself fighting battle after battle, watching as the empire's strength withered under the relentless pressure of enemies from all sides. And now at the very end, with his empire teetering on the edge of oblivion, there was nothing left to fight with, nothing left except desperation. The room grew cold, and Victor looked up to see a shadow standing in the corner. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, but he paused when the figure stepped into the dim light. It wasn't man, but something else, cloaked in darkness, with eyes like embers glowing from within a deep hood. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, rising to his feet. "How did you get past the guard?" The figure's voice was a low rasp like the wind whispering through a graveyard. "I'm merely a messenger, Your Majesty, a herald of opportunity." Victor narrowed his eyes. Opportunity for what? For salvation. The word hung in the air like a promise. Victor felt a chill run down his spine. "Speak plainly. What do you want?" The figure stepped closer, the shadow seeming to cling to him. "I bring an offer that could save your empire." Victor's heart raced. "What kind of offer?" "A pact," the figure said. Extending a hand, in his palm was a small blood-red scroll sealed with an ancient demonic sigil. "With this, you can obtain power beyond anything you have ever known. The power to crush your enemies and restore Australia to its former glory." Victor stared at the scroll, his mind racing. At what cost? The figure's lips curled into a cruel smile. "The cost is blood. Each time you wield this power, a life must be given in return. But not just any life, the life of someone close to you. A sacrifice of love for the sake of the empire." Victor's breath caught in his throat. "I would have to kill those I love." "No," the figure corrected. "The pact will take care of that. You need only wield the power. The rest will be done for you." Victor turned away, his thoughts spinning. He wouldn't. The idea of sacrificing his loved ones for power, it was unthinkable. But then he thought of his people, the empire crumbling around him. He had sworn an oath to protect them, to do whatever it took to keep Australia alive. And now with everything hanging in the balance, could he really afford to turn away from this chance? "You don't have much time," the figure said, his voice like a dagger in Victor's mind. "The enemy will be at your gates. By morning, without this power, you will lose everything." Victor clenched his fists. The weight of the decision bore down on him like an avalanche. He thought of Darius, his sister Alara, his son Lucas, all the people he loved. Could he live with their deaths on his conscience? But then he thought of the Empire, his people, his duty. "Give me the scroll," Victor said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. The figure smiled and placed the scroll in Victor's hand. As soon as Victor touched it, a burning sensation spread through his palm, and the demonic sigil flared to life. The figure bowed once more, then vanished into the shadow. Victor stood there staring at the scroll in his hand. His fate was sealed. The next morning, the sky was dark with storm clouds as Victor led his battered army to the battlefield. The enemy forces, led by the rebellious Lord Theron, stretched across the plains, outnumbering Victor's forces 10-1. His men, weary and outmatched, looked to him with a mixture of fear and desperation. Victor, now clad in black armor, unsheathed the sword he had received along with the Pact bloodfang. The blade was a twisted, jagged thing, pulsing with a sinister red glow. The air around it seemed to hum with dark energy. As the two armies clashed, Victor waded into the thick of battle, wielding bloodfang with terrifying precision. Each swing of the sword sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks, cutting through flesh and steel as though they were nothing. The power was intoxicating, overwhelming. He felt invincible, unstoppable. With every enemy he struck down, the sword seemed to grow stronger, feeding on the blood it spilled. The tide of the battle turned quickly. Lord Theron's forces were no match for Victor's newfound strength. In a matter of hours, the rebels were routed, their forces shattered, and Theron himself was brought to his knees before the Emperor. Victor stood over him, bloodfangs still dripping with blood. Theron looked up at him, fear and hatred in his eyes. "You've become a monster, Victor," Theron spat. "This is no victory. You've sold your soul for power." Victor stared at him for a long moment, then raised his sword and brought it down in a swift arc. Theron's head rolled across the ground and the battlefield fell silent. The Empire had been saved, but the victory felt hollow. As Victor returned to the palace that evening, a sense of dread gnawed at the edges of his mind. The battle had been won, the rebels crushed, but the cost of that victory weighed heavily on his soul. Bloodfang hung at his side, still glowing faintly as though hungry for more. When he entered the palace, he was greeted with grim news. "Allure is dying." The words hit him like a physical blow. He rushed to his sister's chambers, his heart pounding in his chest. There, lying in her bed, was Alara. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow. The court physician hovered nearby, his face grim. "I don't know what's wrong, Your Majesty," the physician said. "She was perfectly healthy this morning, but now it seemed as if her life is draining away." Victor knelt beside her bed, taking her hand in his. "Alara, it's me. I am here." She opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition. "Victor," she whispered, her voice weak. "What have you done?" Victor's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't his fault, that he meant for this to happen. But the truth was there, staring him in the face. He had made the pact, he had used the sword. Now, Alara was paying the price. Tears filled his eyes as he held her hand, feeling her life slip away. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean for this." Alara's hand went limp, and her eyes closed for the last time. Victor stayed there for a long time, his heart heavy with guilt and grief. He had saved the Empire, but at what cost? His sister, the person he had loved most in the world, was gone, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Victor stood beside Alara's lifeless body, his mind numb. He had saved the Empire, but in doing so, he had killed the one person who had always stood by his side. The blood pacts on price had been made clear. Those closest to him would pay for his power with their lives. And yet the Empire still needed him. There were still enemies at the gates, still battles to be fought. He couldn't afford to mourn, not now. He rose slowly from her bedside, his movements mechanical. The court physician bowed his head in sorrow as Victor passed him. But Victor barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, torn between the crushing guilt of Alara's death and the cold necessity of the choices he had made. He felt the weight of Bloodfang at his side, the sword still pulsing faintly with dark energy, its hunger sated for now. But Victor knew it would not remain satisfied for long. As he descended into the main hall, he found Darius waiting for him. The general's face was etched with concern. He had heard the news. "She's still gone," Victor said, his voice flat. Darius' jaw tightened. "I am sorry, Victor. She was a good woman." Victor nodded, though the words felt empty. Darius didn't know the truth. He didn't know that it was Victor Tide, and know the sword, set power, that had taken her life. And Victor couldn't bring himself to tell him not now, not yet. There's something else, Darius said, after a moment, his voice lowering. Lord Gregory, he collapsed earlier today. The physicians are doing what they can, but Victor's heart sank. Lord Gregory was more than just an advisor. He had been like a father to Victor after his own had passed. The thought of losing him now, so soon after Ilara, felt like another cruel twist of the blade. But deep down, Victor knew what was happening. The blood pact was demanding its price once more. I'll see him, Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. Darius placed a hand on his shoulder. You need rest, Victor. You've been through too much already. Victor shook his head. Not yet. I need to see him. The walk to Gregory and his chambers felt longer than any battlefield Victor had faced. Each step was a reminder of the weight that now hung over him. He had traded the lives of those he loved for the power to save his people, but what kind of victory was this, if the price was losing everything? When he entered the room, Gregory lay on the bed, his once strong frame now frail and withered. The old man's breath was shallow, his eyes closed, as if in a deep, troubled sleep. The court physician was at his side, his expression grim. He doesn't have much time, the physician said quietly. Victor knelt beside Gregory's bed, his chest tightening with grief. This man had guided him through his youth, had been the one constant in his life, when everything else was chaos, and now, because of Victor's sad choices, he was slipping away. Gregory's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, they focused on Victor. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Victor leaned closer, desperate to hear his final word. I'm sorry, Gregory whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't protect you from this. Tears welled in Victor's eyes. You've done more than anyone could ever ask, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Gregory's steamed hand, trembling with the effort, reached out and gripped Victor's arm. Be careful, power. It takes everything. And then with a final breath, Gregory was gone. Victor sat there for what felt like hours, holding Gregory's hand, the weight of his words pressing down on him like a vibe. Power takes everything. The truth of those words had never been more clear. He had thought he could control it, that he could wield the power of Bloodfang without losing himself. But now, with each life, the sword claimed it was becoming harder and harder to see the line between duty and madness. He rose slowly, his mind swirling with grief and doubt. He had made a promise to protect the Empire, but at what cost? How many more lives would be lost to this cursed pact? How much more of his soul would the sword devour? But even as these thoughts tormented him, another voice whispered in the back of his mind, the voice of the Whisperer. The Empire needs you. You cannot stop. Now, there are still enemies to be vanquished, still battles to be won, and you are the only one with the power to save them. Victor clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palm. He hated the voice, hated the truth of it. He couldn't stop now. The Empire was still in danger. He had to keep going no matter the cost. But the cost was becoming unbearable. The days turned into weeks, and Victor continued his campaign to restore Aurelia to its former glory. With each battle, he wielded Bloodfang, and with each victory, another loved one was taken from him. Darius noticed the toll it was taking on Victor, the way his eyes grew darker, his demeanor more distant. The Emperor had become a shadow of the man he once was, consumed by the power he had gained and the lives he had lost. The breaking point came when Victor's son, Lucas, returned to the capital. Lucas had been away for years, serving as an ambassador in the distant northern provinces, far from the chaos that had engulfed the Empire. When he returned, he was horrified by what he found. What are you become, Father? Lucas demanded, his voice thick with anger and disbelief. Victor stood at the window of his war room, staring out at the city below. He couldn't bring himself to look at his son, knowing that the moment he did, the guilt would overwhelm him. I've done what I had to do, Victor said quietly. You've turned into a tyrant. Lucas spat. People are afraid to even speak your name. The Empire is terrified of you, and for good reason. You are not the man I remember. Victor closed his eyes, the words cutting deeper than any blade. He had expected this confrontation, but that didn't make it any easier. I did it for you, Victor said, turning to face his son at last. For the Empire, for our people. You did it for power, Lucas replied coldly, and now you've lost everything that mattered. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victor could see the pain in his son's eyes, the betrayal. But what could he say? How could he explain the pact, the terrible price he had paid to keep the empire from falling apart? They lost nothing, Victor said, though. The words felt hollow. The empire is stronger than it's ever been. We are on the verge of complete victory. At what cost? Lucas asked, his voice breaking. Mother is dead. Allure is dead. Gregory is dead. Now you are going to lose me too. Victor's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? I can too stay here, Lucas said, shaking his head. I want to be a part of this madness. I'm leaving, Father. I am leaving before you destroy what little remains of our family. Victor says, world tilted. You can leave, he said, his voice rising in panic. I need you here. But Lucas was already walking toward the door, his mind made up. Victor reached out, his hand trembling. Lucas, please. The door slammed shut. Victor stood frozen, his mind reeling. His son was leaving him. Lucas, the last person he had left in this world, was abandoning him. And the worst part was Victor couldn't even blame him. He had driven everyone away, consumed by the power of the blood pact. But now, as he stood there, alone in the war room, a terrible realization settled over him. Lucas was next. The sword had taken Alara Gregory and countless others, and now it would take his son. Victor marched out of the palace, his heart pounding with fear and desperation. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't lose Lucas, not like this. But as he descended into the courtyard, Bloodfang at his side, the whispers returned. The Empire needs you. The battle is not over. You cannot let him leave. He is your greatest strength. Victor shook his head, trying to silence the voices. He needed to think. He needed to act before it was too late. He had to find Lucas, had to stop him from leaving. But as he reached the palace gates, a cry went up from the soldiers stationed there. My lord, Prince Lucas, he's been attacked. Victor's heart stopped, without thinking. He raced toward the sound of the commotion, his feet pounding against the cobblestone. When he reached the outer courtyard, he found Lucas lying on the ground, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. No, Victor fell to his knees beside his son, his hands shaking as he cradled Lucas' ahead. The prince's eyes fluttered open, his face pale with pain. Father, Lucas whispered, his voice weak. Gone too late. Victor's eyes, vision blurred with tears. He knew in that moment that this was the sword's doing. Bloodfang had claimed its final price. I am sorry, Victor choked out. I am so sorry. Lucas' hand reached up, gripping Victor's arm with the last of his strength. I forgive you. And then he was gone. Victor collapsed beside his son, his body racked with sobs. He had lost everything, his family, his friends, his soul, and for what a throne, an empire. The sword at his side pulsed, its hunger momentarily sated, but Victor knew it wouldn't be long before it demanded more, and this time there was no one left to give. He rose slowly, his movements heavy with exhaustion and grief. There was only one thing left to do. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could end it. Victor walked through the palace, past the empty halls and silent corridors until he reached the crypts beneath the royal chapel. There, in the darkness, he knelt before the tombs of his loved one. Alara Gregory, Lucas, their names were etched into the stone, a stark reminder of what he had lost. He unsheathed Bloodfang, the blade glowing faintly in the dim light. It whispered to him, offering more power, more victories, more conquests. But Victor was done with power. With a final breath, he raised the sword, turning its deadly edge toward himself. I am sorry, he whispered to the Empire, to his family, to the ghosts that haunted him. And then with one swift motion, he plunged the blade into his heart. The blood pact was finally broken.